The silence was the worst part. It always was. Kael stood ankle-deep in spent casing brass and pulverized ferrocrete, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood, mostly alien, but enough human mixed in to remind him that even a cleanup job this simple had sharp edges. He shifted the weight of the pulse rifle, letting the cooling vents hiss against the dead heat of the ruined structure. He was on Rigel 4, Sector 12, a dump of a planet, corporate extraction zone, that went hot 3 cycles ago. The assembly didn't care about the indigenous life here, only the mineral rights and the peculiar biological capabilities of the Zewaith species. His mission was simple: retrieve the asset, designated M7, from the collapsed research outpost and deliver her to the orbiting cruiser, the Arbitrator. The payday was enough to choke a hut, enough for Kael to finally buy a patch of quiet on a non-extractive moon, maybe even get a hydroponics rig running. He looked down at the asset. The Xyth were not physically imposing. They were tall, slender bipeds, covered in fine obsidian-colored chitin that shimmered like oil-slicked water. Their heads were smooth, eyeless domes, relying instead on highly sensitive chemoreceptors and subtle sonic pulses to navigate. They looked fragile, almost graceful, even now, trussed up and secured in the heavy-duty restraint sling. M7 was still. Too still. Kael knelt, ignoring the grating pain in his knees, a souvenir from the last corporate war. He ran his scanner over the restraints. The energy webbing was tight, inhibiting movement and suppressing all but essential neural functions. Standard capture protocol. Vital stable, he muttered to the comm link embedded in his collar. Target secured, proceeding to extraction point Delta 6. A crackle of static, then the cold, processed voice of his handler, Commander Varys. Affirmative, Kael. Move fast. The assembly is nervous about this payload. No detours, no contact. Understood. No contact, Kael confirmed, already lifting the heavy sling onto his back. The weight was manageable, but the moral inertia was not. Kael had been a soldier, a tracker, a mercenary, and now, essentially, a high-end bounty hunter specializing in bioassets. He had done a lot of ugly things for a lot of ugly people, but this felt different. It always felt different when the target wasn't shooting back, wasn't wearing armor, and wasn't motivated by credits or ideology, but something primal. He moved through the wreckage, the sound of his boots echoing loudly in the dead atmosphere. The journey to the landing zone was a kilometer of treacherous terrain, collapsed tunnels and exposed rebar. He kept his focus rigid, compartmentalizing the Xyth on his back into cargo. Cargo, high-value biological asset. M7, credits. He reached the extraction shuttle, a dingy armored transport nicknamed the Mule. He cycled the airlock, the pressure equalization system groaning like a dying beast. Once inside the small main cabin, he secured the sling to the containment module, a reinforced titanium box designed to hold pressurized atmosphere and suppress any attempts at escape or self-destruction. He carefully transferred M7 into the module, locking the heavy hatch. "Let's get this done," he sighed, dropping into the pilot's seat. The ascent was brutal. Rigel 4's gravity well fought them every meter, and the Mule was built for resilience, not speed. As they broke atmosphere, Kael finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, stripping off his heavy helmet and wiping the sweat from his eyes. That's when he heard it. It wasn't a scream or a thrashing sound. The restraint field inside the module wouldn't allow that. It was a sound that vibrated through the deck plates and into Kael's spine, a low, rhythmic thrumming. He frowned, leaning back to look at the containment module's diagnostic screen. The Xyth were known for their sonic communication, a complex language of clicks, pulses, and deep infrasound. This was something else. It was repetitive, almost musical, but laced with a desperation that cut through the scientific readings. Kael activated the internal microphone, piping the sound into his headphones. Thrum, thrum, pause. Thrum, thrum, pause. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was a heartbeat rhythm, only slightly too fast, a frantic, consistent pattern that showed no sign of stopping. He checked the diagnostics again. Heart rate elevated, but stable. Neural activity high, but coherent. She wasn't fighting the restraints. She was just making noise. Shut up, Kael grumbled, mostly to himself. He reached for the manual override to increase the dampening field, but paused. Increasing the field too much could cause neural damage, and Varys had been very specific. The asset must arrive pristine. He watched the module screen, which showed a grainy thermal image of M7. She was curled into a fetal position, her body barely moving, yet the rhythmic pulse continued. Kael had seen fear. He had seen rage. This wasn't either. This was seeking. He pulled up the Yizwaith Behavioral Archive, old dusty files he kept from his days working for the Assembly's Xenolinguistics Division, before the credits dried up and the moral lines blurred. He cross-referenced the sonic pattern. The results flashed red. Maternal distress call. Pattern B3, used for long-distance communication with juvenile offspring. Kael felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He scrubbed the screen, thinking the database was corrupted. He ran the analysis again. Same result. Pattern B3. A lullaby, maybe, but one played on a broken, desperate frequency. M7 wasn't just an asset. She was a mother. This changed everything. The Assembly didn't capture Scythe for fighting or heavy labor. They captured them for their unique neural architecture. The Scythe mind could process complex data streams and perform multidimensional calculations faster than any known computer matrix. They were living processors, usually kept in deep sleep, hooked into corporate networks until their minds burned out. And they were valuable, incredibly valuable. Kael stared out at the star-dusted void, the massive, silent bulk of the arbitrator growing steadily larger in the viewport. He was minutes away from delivering a sentient being into a hell of perpetual, conscious captivity. And the only reason she was making this sound was because somewhere, likely back on that scorched rock, she had children waiting for a reply that would never come. The credits suddenly felt like lead weights in his pocket. Thrum, thrum, pause. Thrum, thrum, thrum. He ran a hand over his face. He was a survivor. He had a job. The Assembly didn't tolerate morality. They certainly didn't tolerate sentimentality about indigenous life forms. If he hesitated, if he showed the slightest sign of compromise, he wouldn't just lose the credits, he would lose his life. Focus, Kael, he whispered. You take the money. You walk away. It's not your fight. But the sound was persistent, drilling into the part of his brain he thought he had successfully cauterized years ago, the part that remembered what it meant to be human, to feel the sharp, agonizing pull of a debt unpaid. He couldn't just deliver her, not now. He initiated the docking sequence, his hands moving automatically over the controls, but his mind was running at a frantic pace, searching for an angle, a loophole, a way to unfuck this impossible situation without triggering a corporate meltdown. As the mule slotted into Bay 4 of the arbitrator, Kael made a decision born of desperation and a sudden, searing shame. He needed information. If she was a mother, where were the children? Were they still on Rigel 4? Were they captured by someone else? He had to know the full weight of the transaction before he closed the deal. The airlock hissed open, and the cold, sanitized air of the cruiser rushed in. Two imposing figures, Assembly enforcers, chromed armor gleaming, stood waiting, their pulse rifles held at parade rest. Behind them, Commander Varys, a pale, rail-thin man whose eyes were always calculating the cost of everything. "Kael," Varys said, his voice clipped and impatient. "You're late. Where is the asset?" "Secured, Commander," Kael replied, forcing a professional calm into his voice. He stood up, blocking the view of the containment module momentarily. Rigel 4 was rougher than anticipated. Had to take some fire. I need to run a final diagnostic check on M7's containment field before transfer. Standard protocol for high-value bioassets. Varys narrowed his eyes. We have technicians for that. Get out of the way, Kael. We need her in the processing unit now. Respectfully, Commander, Kael pushed back, knowing this was dangerous ground. If there's a glitch in the field, and she compromises the module during transfer, the cost is on me. I want the sign-off. Varys bristled, but Kael's logic was sound. Corporate bureaucracy was a powerful weapon. Using the threat of liability often worked better than a gun. Fine, Varys snapped, waving a dismissive hand at the enforcers. You have 5 minutes. Do not touch the asset. The field dampening is calibrated precisely. Kael nodded, his heart pounding against his ribs. 5 minutes. The moment Varys and the guards moved a few paces away to discuss logistics, Kael wheeled around to the module. He didn't have time for sophisticated hacking. He needed a direct channel. He opened a small panel on the module's exterior and plugged in his personal data slate. A heavily encrypted device he used for tracking and analysis, never connected to the assembly network. He bypassed the module's security lockouts and accessed the internal microphone feed, pumping the audio directly into the slate. Thrum-thrum pause. Thrum-thrum-thrum. Kael quickly switched the slate to a low-frequency broadcast mode, aiming the subtle signal back into the module's atmosphere. He wasn't trying to communicate, only to introduce a tiny, specific harmonic distortion into the air. The ex-wife were highly sensitive to sonic cues. If she was sending a call, she would react to a specific alteration in her environment. He waited, the seconds stretching into infinity. The rhythmic thrumming stopped abruptly. Silence. Kael held his breath. Then, a new sound. It was softer, higher pitched, almost a squeak, but the pattern was unmistakable. A question. Where? Kael knew he couldn't reply directly. Any language would be recorded by the module's latent systems, even if Varys wasn't actively monitoring. He had to be subtle. He ran a quick scan of the Zeeth's neural activity, projecting the data onto his slate screen, a mess of spiking energy. He needed to plant a seed of information, a single non-verbal clue. He accessed the module's atmospheric controls. He couldn't change the pressure or the temperature drastically, but he could release a tiny, measured puff of gas, a common, inert propellant used in the shuttle's cooling systems. The Geith communicated family ties and location through complex scent markings, a secondary system to their sonic language. Kael had read that different family groups used highly refined chemical signatures derived from local flora. Rigel 4 was known for the unique, pungent scent of the iron root fungus, a marker used by the Ixwhite communities in that sector. Kael didn't have iron root extract, but he had the next best thing. The faint, residual propellant scent clinging to his armor from the toxic atmosphere of Rigel 4's extraction tunnels. He had carried the smell of that sector all the way here. He released the smallest possible burst of the cooling gas into the module, just enough to carry the ambient scent of Rigel 4. It was a massive gamble. The Exythe might interpret it as contamination or a threat. But M7 reacted instantly. The neural activity spiked again, then settled into a furious, focused rhythm. The thermal image showed her shifting, pressing her face against the titanium wall closest to the source of the gas. Then, the sonic pattern returned. But this time, it was different. It was a complex series of rapid clicks and pulses, a burst of data, not distress. Kael quickly recorded the audio burst onto his slate, disconnecting the device an instant before Varys called out, "Time's up, Kael. Move aside." "Final diagnostic complete, Commander," Kael said, stepping away from the module, his face a mask of professional boredom. "Containment field is stable, ready for transfer." Varys gave him a skeptical look, then nodded to the enforcers. Take it. As the enforcers began maneuvering the heavy module out of the mule, Kael felt the weight of the data slate in his hand, the only thing that separated him from being a glorified delivery boy and a conspirator in a galactic crime. He had the sound. Now he had to decipher it. He followed the procession down the sterile white corridors of the arbitrator. The ship was cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of anything resembling life. It was a perfect cage. They reached the processing deck. It was a massive hangar-like space filled with humming machinery, reinforced glass cells, and specialized medical equipment. This was where assets were prepared for deep storage and neural linking. Varys supervised the transfer of M7 into a temporary holding cell. He then turned to Kael, pulling up a digital contract on his own slate. Sign here, confirming delivery of high-value asset M7, pristine condition. Kael took the slate. The number glowed brightly. 500 credits. A fortune. Freedom. He took the stylus, his hand steady. He signed the contract. He watched the credits transfer into his encrypted off-world account. "Pleasure doing business, Commander," Kael said, the lie tasting like ash. Varys didn't bother with pleasantries. "The next extraction is in Sector Gamma 9. We need a team leader. Interested?" "No, Commander," Kael said, shaking his head. "I think I'll take a sabbatical. Retirement looks good today." Varys shrugged, already dismissing him. "Fine. Get off my ship, Kael, and don't contact us again unless you're desperate." Kael didn't need telling twice. He retrieved his weapons and gear from the armory, his heart still hammering the frantic rhythm of the Geith call. He was free, rich, and damned. Back in the solitude of the mule, accelerating away from the arbitrator and its looming silent threat, Kael finally pulled out his data slate. He put on his headphones and replayed the audio burst he had recorded. The clicking was too fast, too dense for basic analysis. It was a compressed file, likely the exvieth equivalent of a data packet. He ran the signal through a neural linguistic filter he had built years ago, designed to interpret complex, non-verbal communication based on pattern recognition and emotional context. It took 10 minutes for the filter to process the burst. When the translation finally appeared on the screen, it wasn't a sentence, but a geographical coordinate overlaid with a single, repeating symbol. The coordinates pointed not to Rigel 4, but to a remote, asteroid belt outpost known as the Shunt, a notorious black market hub deep in the contested territories. And the symbol? It was the excythe glyph for nursery, or hatchling. Kael slumped back in his seat, staring at the glowing data. M7 hadn't been calling her children. She had been telling someone where they were, and by introducing the scent of Rigel 4, Kael had confirmed to her that he was someone who knew the world she had been taken from, someone who could potentially receive the message. The assembly hadn't just captured the mother. They had captured her separately from her young, likely to prevent contamination or damage during transport. The children were still out there, possibly sold already, or waiting to be picked up. The Shunt. That meant black marketeers, pirates, and smugglers. If M7's young were there, they were being held for auction or sale to another corporate entity, perhaps one even darker than the assembly. Kael looked at the coordinates, then at the credit balance on his separate, secure account. 500 credits. Freedom. He had signed the contract. He had taken the money. He was clean. He could jump out of the system right now and never look back. But the ghost of that desperate, rhythmic thrumming was still echoing in his ears. He had opened the door to this, however slightly, by responding to her distress. He had acknowledged her humanity, or whatever the exvieth equivalent was. He couldn't leave them. The cost of those credits was too high. Kael gripped the controls of the mule. He pulled up the navigation map. The Shunt was 3 days at maximum burn, right through a heavily patrolled Sector 7. Suicidal, but necessary. He didn't need to ask himself what he was doing. He was buying his conscience back. He locked in the coordinates for the shunt. He needed to move fast, before the black market auctioneers realized exactly what they were holding. He was no longer a bounty hunter. He was about to become a thief, a rescuer, and a target of the entire corporate assembly. "All right, M7, Kael muttered, settling in for the long, dangerous haul. "Let's go find your kids." He armed the weapon systems, checked the fuel reserves, and pushed the mule into the deep black, heading straight toward the contested territories, carrying the full, paralyzing weight of a 500,000 credit mistake. His retirement was officially cancelled. The real work was just beginning. 3 days at maximum burn. That's what it took to cross Sector 7, a stretch of contested space where corporate patrols overlapped with pirate territories like overlapping layers of razor wire. Kael pushed the mule harder than he ever had, ignoring the persistent whine from the starboard engine mounts and the flickering warning lights on the coolant systems. He wasn't running from the assembly yet, but he knew the clock was ticking. Varus was a cold calculator. It would take him maybe a week to realize Kael wasn't just on sabbatical, especially if corporate rivals started noticing a specific high-value asset wasn't where it was supposed to be. Kael spent the first day scrubbing the mule. He used chemical solvents and thermal blasts to strip away the distinctive blue-gray assembly paint, replacing it with a mottled, rust-colored camouflage pattern. He purged the transponder codes and rerouted the ship's primary broadcast signature to mimic a generic, low-grade freighter, the kind nobody bothered to scan twice. He paid cash, using his new credits, to buy fake manifests and encrypted navigation charts that promised a route through the asteroid fields that even the Sector 7 Customs Authority pretended didn't exist. He was operating on pure adrenaline and logistics. The 500 zero-Xenon credits were now a rapidly depleting operational fund. He needed specialized equipment for infiltration and retrieval, tools he had pawned off years ago when he decided he was done with this life. He bought back what he needed on the fly, negotiating through encrypted channels with shady dealers on desolate way stations, paying premium prices for anonymity. The coordinates M7 had sent pointed to the shunt, a place Kael knew by reputation, which was saying something. It wasn't a station, it was a gravitational anchor point, a massive, ancient asteroid that had accumulated scrap, derelict ships, and habitation modules over centuries of lawless trade. It was a tumor on the galaxy's trade routes, a place where credits mattered more than laws, and life was cheaper than a tank of nitrogen. As he approached, the sensor array screamed with noise. The shunt wasn't quiet. It pulsed with the energy signatures of hundreds of mismatched vessels, the static of unmanaged comms traffic, and the low, heavy hum of unlicensed fusion reactors. Kael brought the mule in low, weaving through the dense field of space debris. The external view was a kaleidoscope of rust, patched metal, and blinking hazard lights. There was no docking control, only a chaotic free-for-all. He found a spot deep in the maintenance sector, Bay 14, a massive, unlit cavern smelling strongly of stale fuel and cheap synth alcohol. He paid the docking fee, a staggering 10 Xenon credits, non-negotiable, to a hulking, four-armed dockmaster who didn't even look up from his data pad. Once secured, Kael changed out of his mercenary armor. He needed to blend in. He donned worn, dark synth leather salvaged from his old gear locker, a heavy utility belt, and a low-profile energy pistol holstered discreetly beneath a long, trench-style coat that hid his frame. He roughened his face with a few days' growth of stubble and applied a mild, localized static field to his coat to mimic the look of having just survived a minor electrical fire, standard aesthetic for low-tier salvagers. He stepped out of the mule into the thick, humid air of the shunt. The noise hit him first, a cacophony of shouting in 36 languages, the clang of metal on metal, and the pervasive throbbing beat of music coming from the upper levels. The gravity here was synthetic and slightly off-kilter, giving Kael a subtle, dizzying sensation. He moved through the bay, keeping his hands visible and his eyes scanning constantly. Every corner, every shadow, held the promise of a knife or a fast-talking scammer. He needed information, and there was only one place to get reliable data on bioassets this quickly: the Serpent's Coil. It was a notorious information exchange disguised as a bar, deep in the central hub. The walk was a nightmare of crowded passages, slick with unknown fluids and littered with refuse. He passed stalls selling everything from illegal weaponry to synthetic organs. The air tasted metallic and sour. Kael kept his head down, moving with the practiced indifference of a man who had seen too much. He reached the Serpent's Coil. It was dark, smoky, and loud. The bar was manned by a massive reptilian biped whose scales were the color of stagnant oil. Kael found a small, shadowed booth near the back, ordering a cheap, potent synth whiskey. He wasn't looking for the bartender. He was looking for Sira. Sira was a data scrapper, a small, wiry woman with cybernetic implants covering half her face. She specialized in bridging the gap between corporate data leaks and black market supply chains. She was greedy, but surprisingly professional. Kael waited, nursing his drink. It took 20 minutes, but Sira eventually slid into the booth opposite him. Her eyes, one natural, one glowing red, darting across the room. "Kael," she hissed, her voice a low, mechanical whisper. "I thought you were dead, or working for the assembly now. What gives?" "I retired," Kael said simply, placing a small, heavy pouch of credits on the table. It was 5 Yo0 credits, enough to buy her loyalty for the next hour. "I'm looking for cargo, specific cargo," Sira's natural eye fixed on the pouch. "The kind that moves fast, right? The kind the assembly might be looking for?" "The kind that was misplaced by a third party," Kael corrected smoothly. "Biological asset. Suaith, juvenile. Possibly 3 units. They were recently moved from Rigel 4. Sira whistled, a low digital sound. "Rigel 4. That's hot territory. The assembly has a tight grip on Scythe bioassets. You're playing with fire, Kael." "I have the credits to extinguish the flame," he said, pushing the pouch closer. "Where are they? Who has them?" Sira grabbed the pouch, her thin fingers counting the chips with practiced speed. She leaned in, the smell of burnt wiring and cheap stimulants wafting off her. "They're here, Kael. But you are late. Very late." Kael felt a cold spike of dread. "How late?" "The broker?" Sira whispered the name like a curse. "He took delivery of 3 Ixythe hatchlings 2 cycles ago. Pristine condition. They're high value, Kael. Not just for processing. They're being offered as research models to a private consortium. They are currently being prepped for viewing." "Viewing?" "A private auction, Kael. Tomorrow morning, local time. The broker only deals with the top tier, corporate intelligence, independent research groups. He's not selling them to some pirate lord." This was worse than Kael had imagined. If they were sold to a private consortium, they would disappear into an untraceable network of labs, likely never to be seen again. He had less than 12 hours. "Where is the broker keeping them?" Kael demanded, his voice low and urgent. Sira hesitated, looking nervous. "That information is worth more than 5,000, Kael. That's risking my life." Kael reached into his coat and pulled out a data slate, accessing his secure account. He didn't show her the total, but he transferred 20 Zo0 credits instantly to her account. "That buys me a map, Sira, and an access route." Sira's red eye blinked rapidly. The money was too good to refuse. "The broker operates out of the upper levels of the central spire," she explained, gesturing vaguely upwards. It's heavily fortified, but the assets aren't in the spire itself. They're in a reinforced module suspended beneath the spire, accessible only by a single gravity lift, or through the old maintenance shafts of the derelict Vindicator cruiser, Sector Alpha 9. The module is pressure-sealed and guarded by his personal security detail, the Iron Dogs. They don't take bribes, Kael. They shoot first, then check the paperwork. She pulled up a schematic on her own datapad and quickly transferred a heavily annotated map to Kael's slate. It showed the central spire, the suspended module, and the incredibly complex decaying network of maintenance tunnels leading to the target. The module is called the nursery cage, Sierra added, her voice dropping lower. It's designed to keep the atmosphere and light precisely controlled for the juveniles. They are being monitored constantly. If you breach the outer shell, alarms go off throughout the spire. If you try to disable the life support, you kill the kids. Kael studied the map. It was a tactical nightmare. Too many choke points, too much redundancy in the security system. The Iron Dogs were ex-military, highly trained, and ruthless. What about the auction itself? Kael asked. When do they move the assets? They don't move the assets for the viewing, Sierra said, shaking her head. The buyers are brought to the cage. They want the assets to be fresh, responsive, and clearly healthy. Security will be tripled at dawn, local time, when the first buyers arrive. You have to get them out before then. Kael nodded slowly. He had maybe 6 hours to prepare and 6 hours to execute. He stood up, pulling his coat tighter. Thanks, Sierra. Don't mention this conversation to anyone. Kael, she called after him, her voice serious. You got your money. You bought your freedom. What you are attempting now is suicide. Why risk everything for 3 little packets of chitin and nerves? Kael paused at the exit, looking back into the smoky interior of the Serpent's Coil. Because, he said, the words heavy with conviction, I already took the first payment. Now I have to pay the debt. He left the bar and plunged back into the chaos of the shunt, heading directly back to Bay 14. Back in the mule, Kael locked down the airlock and went straight to work. He spread the schematic across the cockpit display, overlaying it with thermal scans and structural integrity reports Sierra had sourced. The plan had to be surgical. Any prolonged firefight would bring down the entire security force of the shunt, and he'd be overwhelmed. He needed speed, silence, and misdirection. He looked at the map of Sector Alpha 9, the derelict Vindicator. It was unstable, prone to sudden depressurization and collapsing bulkheads. Perfect. Kael pulled out his gear. He selected 2 plasma charges, carefully setting the yield for maximum structural damage with minimal atmospheric contamination. He also took his pulse rifle, stripped down for close-quarters combat, and an array of specialized sonic dampeners. If M7 communicated via sound, her young would too. Kael needed to ensure that when he breached the nursery cage, the young Zeeth didn't panic and alert the guards with a distress call. He also needed a distraction, a big one. Kael accessed his remaining credit balance. He had roughly 470 Lero-Zeron credits left. He was going to spend a good chunk of it. He opened a secure channel to a known destabilization expert, a drone hacker named Wrench, who operated out of a nearby, equally chaotic cluster. Wrench specialized in causing large-scale, localized mayhem for high prices. Wrench, Kael typed. I need a Class 4 diversion, central spire, maximum duration 20 minutes, budget 50 Josenaris credits. The reply was instantaneous and riddled with emojis. 50K for 20 minutes of hell? You must be desperate, Kael. What's the target? The central spire's primary power grid. I want a cascade failure. Make it look like a massive overload. I need every security drone and Iron Dog focused on the power core, not the suspended module. Done. Consider it a fireworks show. Payment upon confirmation of service disruption. Kael confirmed the transfer. Another 50,000 credits gone, dedicated to creating a 20-minute window of absolute chaos. He had his plan. Infiltrate via the derelict Vindicator tunnels. Use the power surge as cover. Breach the nursery cage. Extract the hatchlings. Get back to the mule. But the most difficult part wasn't the guards or the structural instability. It was handling the Scythe young. They would be terrified, restrained, and incapable of understanding what was happening. He needed a way to communicate reassurance, a non-verbal signal that he wasn't another captor. He remembered the sonic pattern M7 had used. Pattern B3, the maternal distress call. Kael worked quickly, configuring a small handheld sonic emitter. He programmed it to play the inverse of the distress call, a specific harmonic sequence that, according to the archived Scythe data, was associated with all clear or parental presence. It was a long shot, but it was the only psychological tool he had. As he finished loading his gear, strapping the specialized extraction pack to his back, Kael looked at the credit balance one last time. It was still a huge amount, enough for a comfortable life. But compared to the weight of the moral debt he was carrying, it felt like nothing. He checked his chrono. Local time, 01:00. Dawn was at 07:00. 6 hours. He cycled the airlock and stepped out into Bay 14 again, moving toward the dark, recessed entrance to Sector Alpha 9. The derelict Vindicator loomed like a decaying metal skeleton in the distance, its massive hull breached in a dozen places. The entrance to Alpha 9 was a narrow, unlit passage guarded by a single bored-looking sentry, a low-level thug Kael paid 50 credits to look the other way, claiming he was fetching spare parts from the wreckage. The moment Kael stepped into the Vindicator's hull, the ambient temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air was dry and smelled of old rust and vacuum. He activated his helmet lamp. The light cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating a tunnel of twisted metal and exposed wiring. Every step was a careful calculation. One wrong move could trigger a cascade of collapsing debris. He moved silently, relying on the schematics Sira had provided. The tunnel system was complex, designed for maintenance drones, not armored bipeds. Kael had to crawl, squeeze, and climb through tight passages, the metal groaning ominously around him. After 30 minutes of grueling movement, he reached the designated breach point, a heavily reinforced bulkhead separating the derelict cruiser from the active infrastructure of the central spire. He pressed his ear against the cold metal. He could hear the faint, rhythmic thump-thump of heavy boots on the other side, the iron dogs patrolling the corridor leading to the gravity lift. Kael planted the first plasma charge precisely on the bulkhead's locking mechanism. He set the timer for a 2-minute delay, enough time to get into position. He then moved to the second charge, placing it strategically to destabilize the structural integrity of the tunnel he had just traversed. This wasn't for security, it was for retreat. If he needed to seal off his escape route, he would. He pulled back, finding a solid piece of debris to brace himself against. He checked his comms. Wrench was online. "Ready when you are, Kael," Wrench messaged. "Power grid is primed." Kael took a deep breath, the stale, recycled air burning his lungs. This was the point of no return. "Now!" Kael messaged back. A second later, the entire structure of the shunt seemed to scream. The lights in the tunnel flickered violently, then died, plunging Kael into absolute darkness, save for the faint green glow of his helmet display. The sound was deafening, the roar of failing fusion reactors, the screech of overloaded circuits, and the sudden, frantic blare of emergency alarms echoing through the metal halls. The diversion was active. The plasma charge on the bulkhead detonated with a sharp, contained thwump. The lock vaporized, leaving a clean, smoking hole. Kael didn't hesitate. He kicked the weakened section of the bulkhead open, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the adjacent corridor. He rolled through the opening, rifle raised. The corridor was in chaos. Emergency lights pulsed red, illuminating two iron dogs scrambling for their weapons, clearly disoriented by the power failure. They were heavy, armored, and slow to react. Kael fired a 3-round burst from his pulse rifle. The concentrated energy bolts hit the lead dog in the chest plate. The armor wasn't breached, but the kinetic force was enough to knock the guard off his feet, sending him sprawling against the wall. The second dog reacted, raising his rifle, but Kael was already moving. He closed the distance in 2 strides, using the momentum to slam the butt of his rifle into the dog's helmet. The guard collapsed, stunned. Kael didn't kill them. He couldn't afford the noise. He quickly moved to the prone guards, applying high-frequency neural disruptors to their necks. Standard non-lethal military kit, designed to ensure deep unconsciousness. He was in the spire now. The gravity lift was 20 meters ahead, and beyond it, the access point to the suspended nursery cage. He moved toward the lift, his boots silent on the ferrocrete floor. He could hear more iron dogs mobilizing further down the corridor, their heavy footsteps muffled by the pervasive alarm noise. They were moving toward the central power core, exactly as Wrench intended. Kael reached the gravity lift controls. The primary system was down due to the power surge, but Kael's scans showed the localized manual override was still operational, running on a backup battery. He bypassed the lock and activated the lift. It hissed open. Kael stepped inside. The lift was small, designed only for cargo or a few personnel. Kael activated the descent. The lift dropped rapidly, taking him down beneath the spire's main structure. Through the reinforced glass floor, Kael could see the void of space, and suspended directly below the spire, the target, the nursery cage. It was a large cylindrical module, glowing faintly with internal lights, surrounded by a heavy, rotating perimeter defense system that was currently sluggish due to the power disruption. The lift docked smoothly. Kael stepped out onto a narrow walkway that encircled the module. The air was colder here, exposed to the vacuum on all sides. He approached the main airlock of the nursery cage. 2 more iron dogs stood guard. These ones were focused, holding position, weapons trained on the lift. They hadn't fallen for the power core distraction. They knew their assignment. "Hold. Identify yourself!" One of them bellowed over the alarms. Kael didn't answer. He was already committed. He dropped a flashbang grenade customized for maximum sonic disruption and minimal light output. It detonated with a sharp, localized crack. The guards flinched, their internal comms likely buzzing painfully. Kael used the half-second of disorientation. He fired a single shot, not at the guards, but at the structural coupling of the walkway railing behind them. The rail buckled and twisted, creating an immediate hazard. He charged forward, tackling the first guard, driving him toward the newly created gap in the railing. The guard struggled, his heavy armor a massive obstacle, but Kael's desperation lent him strength. With a grunt, Kael shoved the guard over the edge. The iron dog didn't fall into space. He swung, his safety tether catching him with a painful jerk, leaving him dangling precariously, cursing loudly. The second guard was recovering, aiming his rifle. Kael didn't engage. He dodged the incoming pulse fire and slammed his shoulder into the airlock door, reaching for the controls. The airlock was secured with a magnetic lock, currently weakened by the power failure. Kael pulled out a small, specialized pry bar, jamming it into the access panel. He exerted all his weight, the metal groaning in protest. The second iron dog was now firing steadily, forcing Kael to move erratically, sparks flying around him as the shots grazed the module wall. Come on, come on. With a final, desperate heave, the magnetic lock shrieked and released. The airlock hissed open. Kael didn't wait. He ducked into the airlock, slamming the inner door controls. The iron dog outside screamed in frustration, pounding on the outer door. Kael ignored him, focusing on the immediate threat, the internal security. He rushed through the airlock and into the main containment chamber. The room was quiet, brightly lit, and temperature-controlled. In the center, there was a single large containment unit made of reinforced transparent synth glass. Inside, Kael saw them. 3 small Geith hatchlings. They were smaller than M7, their obsidian chitons still soft and translucent. They were curled together, restrained by thin, bio-inhibiting nets, but otherwise unharmed. They looked like terrified, fragile jewels. They were making a sound, a high-pitched, faint clicking, a sound of confusion and fear. Kael knew he had seconds. The external security would breach the airlock soon. He moved to the containment unit's control panel. He had to disable the restraints and open the unit without triggering a lethal depressurization or an internal security response. He plugged his data slate into the containment unit's diagnostics port. The system was customized, designed by the broker to be complex, but the power surge had provided a crucial vulnerability. Kael bypassed the primary security protocols, focusing on the restraint field. Disengage. The nets holding the 3 hatchlings shimmered, then dissolved into harmless particles. The Exith young immediately began thrashing, their sonic distress calls spiking in volume. "Easy," Kael muttered, even though they couldn't understand him. "I'm not here to hurt you." He quickly activated his handheld sonic emitter. He aimed the device at the glass, releasing the specific all-clear harmonic pattern M7 had helped him create. The sound was low, gentle, and utterly alien. The 3 hatchlings froze instantly. Their frantic clicking stopped. They turned their smooth, eyeless domes toward the sound source, their chemoreceptors likely analyzing the reassuring parental signature embedded in the frequency. Kael saw his chance. He hit the manual release on the containment unit door. It slid open with a heavy thunk. He reached in, pulling the specialized extraction pack, a large, soft, thermal-regulated pouch designed for sensitive biological assets. He had to move fast. He gently scooped up the first hatchling, tucking it into the pack. It was light, almost weightless, and surprisingly warm. He reached for the second. Just then, the main airlock door behind him detonated inward with a violent crash. "Freeze, mercenary! Put them down!" 3 iron dogs, now armored and carrying heavy shield plating, stormed the room. They had bypassed the outer door and were ready to fight. Kael had no time to explain. He had 2 hatchlings secure, 1 left. He grabbed the 3rd Zyth, shoving it into the pack. He sealed the pack instantly, securing it tightly to his back. He spun around, drawing his pulse rifle. "I don't want to fight," Kael yelled, his voice echoing in the small chamber. "Let me walk away, and this is over." "You breached a secure asset containment unit," the lead dog roared, raising his weapon. "You're dead." The iron dogs opened fire. Kael dropped, rolling behind the thick synth glass of the open containment unit, using it as temporary cover. The pulsed energy blasts hammered the glass, cracking it instantly. Kael knew he was outmatched. 3 against 1, heavily armored, and he was carrying fragile cargo. He aimed for the weak points. He fired a rapid burst at the lead dog's knee joint. The armor buckled, and the dog cried out, dropping his shield. Kael didn't wait for the others. His 20 minutes of chaos were rapidly running out. He turned and sprinted toward the far wall, where Sierra's map indicated an emergency maintenance shaft leading back up into the spire's main structure. A final, desperate escape route. He hit the access panel, blowing the lock with a single, precise pulse shot. He plunged into the narrow, dark shaft, the sound of the iron dog's heavy pursuit echoing behind him. He was inside the walls now, carrying the weight of 3 frightened lives and the certainty of immediate, brutal retaliation. He had the young, but the debt was far from paid. He still had to get them out of the shunt alive. The sound of the iron dog's heavy boots was immediately behind Kael, echoing up the narrow maintenance shaft. He scrambled upward, the extraction pack on his back jostling with the precious, fragile cargo. The hatchlings were silent now, the all-clear frequency still humming softly from the emitter tucked inside the pack, keeping their panic subdued. Kael reached the coordinates Sierra had marked for the structural weakness, a major junction point where the old Vindicator hull met the spire. He pulled the remote detonator for the second plasma charge he had planted earlier. He didn't look back. He pressed the button. The detonation was muffled but powerful, localized to the precise structural point. The ground beneath Kael's feet shuddered violently. A sickening sound of tearing metal followed as the junction buckled. Kael felt a rush of displaced air and dust as the shaft behind him collapsed in a torrent of ferrocrete and twisted rebar. The pursuit stopped instantly, replaced by a roar of frustration and the sound of heavy debris settling. Kael didn't pause to celebrate. That blast had bought him maybe 5 minutes, and it had confirmed to every remaining guard that their target was not heading for the gravity lift, but deeper into the spire's infrastructure. He climbed the final few meters and kicked open the access panel, emerging onto a service level that was now dimly lit by stuttering emergency lights. The power grid was attempting to stabilize, meaning Wrench's 20 minutes of chaos were nearly over. Kael was no longer hidden. He moved through the service corridors, running low, using the shadows cast by the flickering lights. He could hear the distinct whine of security drones being activated. The broker was locking down the station. He needed to get back to Bay 14, 3 levels down and a kilometer across the central hub. The corridors were starting to fill with panicked station staff and low-level thugs who knew a system failure meant opportunity. Kael used the crowd as cover, melting into the streams of moving bodies, his long coat obscuring the biological pack on his back. He reached the main thoroughfare, a massive, multi-level bazaar that was now plunged into near darkness. The confusion was total. This is better than a clear path, Kael thought, pushing through the dense mass of beings. He heard a voice crackle over a localized comms frequency, an Iron Dog broadcast, raw and urgent. Target is confirmed on level 3, heading west toward the docks. Distinctive heavy armor, dark coat. Engage on sight. Kael knew his disguise was failing. The Iron Dogs were tracking his heat signature, or perhaps the residual energy from his rifle fire. He had to create a new, overwhelming distraction. He reached the edge of the central plaza, where a massive, illegally modified fuel tank sat precariously near a stack of high-yield plasma canisters. Kael pulled a single, small fragmentation grenade from his belt, set the timer for 5 seconds, and lobbed it toward the fuel tank. He didn't wait for the explosion. He sprinted into a downward ramp leading toward the docking bays. The blast was catastrophic. It wasn't just noise. It was localized destruction. The fuel tank ruptured, sending a wave of burning synth fuel across the plaza, followed by the terrifying, echoing thump of the plasma canisters detonating. Screams erupted, drowning out the alarms. The Iron Dogs, now facing mass casualties and a raging fire, would be forced to divert most of their remaining force to containment. Kael flew down the ramp, adrenaline masking the ache in his knees. He was running on borrowed time and burning credits, but he was close. Bay 14. He burst into the massive, dark hangar. It was quieter here, the fire and panic muffled by the thick ferrocrete walls, but not empty. The 4-armed dockmaster, a hulking brute named Zant, stood near the mule's airlock, blocking the path. Zant was holding a massive pulse cannon that looked like it was scavenged from an orbital defense platform. "You owe me a docking fee, Kael," Zant growled, his 4 eyes glowing red in the dim light. "And the broker says you owe him a lot more." Kael stopped, raising his hands slowly, his pulse rifle hanging loose at his side. "Zant," Kael said, keeping his voice calm, "I gave you 10, I don't know 0 credits. Keep the change. Step aside. The broker offered me 50,000 to hold you here, Zant countered, leveling the cannon. That's better than your retirement plan. Kael glanced at the mule. The ship was 20 feet away. Too far to rush, too close to fight a heavy weapon in the open. 50,000 is nothing when the assembly finds out what the broker is moving, Kael pressed, trying to appeal to Zant's survival instinct. If you help me, I guarantee you walk away clean. If you fight me, you die here, and the broker leaves your carcass for the scrappers. Zant hesitated, the cannon wavering slightly. He was a mercenary, not a zealot. That moment of indecision was all Kael needed. Kael didn't shoot Zant. He fired a rapid burst at the massive hydraulic piston controlling the main bay door nearest Zant. The piston screamed as the pulse energy overloaded the seals. The heavy door, already strained by the power surge, began to grind and collapse inward, releasing a terrifying, high-pressure rush of vacuum-chilled air into the bay. Zant, startled by the sudden, massive structural failure and the drop in pressure, instinctively turned his attention to the collapsing door. Kael moved. He sprinted toward the mule, pulling a high-frequency jamming device from his belt and tossing it toward Zant. The device activated, bathing the dockmaster in a blinding, painful static field designed to overload neural processing. Zant roared, dropping the cannon, clutching his head. Kael reached the mule's airlock, slamming his hand onto the emergency release. The door hissed open. He tumbled inside, the extraction pack heavy on his back. He didn't waste a second. He sealed the airlock and scrambled into the pilot's seat. Outside, Zant was recovering, his massive shape moving toward the ship again, retrieving his cannon. Kael could also hear the frantic, heavy rhythm of multiple iron dogs approaching the bay entrance. Kael slammed his fist onto the ignition sequence. The engines whined, the massive fusion core struggling to reach operational readiness after the system shock. Engines nominal. 30 seconds to full thrust, the ship computer warned. 30 seconds was an eternity. Kael pulled up the bay schematic. The magnetic locks securing the mule to the deck were still engaged, and the main bay door was partially collapsed, but not open enough for escape. He had to force the issue. He diverted all auxiliary power, everything that wasn't strictly necessary for engine startup, to the forward-facing weapons systems. He armed the heavy plasma cannons. Zant was less than 10 feet away, aiming his cannon at the cockpit. Kael closed his eyes for a split second, bracing for impact. He fired the main plasma cannons. He didn't aim at Zant. He aimed at the magnetic locks holding the mule to the floor and the remaining structural supports of the collapsed bay door. The blast was deafening inside the cockpit, even with the shielding. The ship shuddered violently as the plasma vaporized the locks and blasted a massive, jagged hole through the bay door structure. The sheer force of the explosion sent Zant reeling backward, his cannon flying into the darkness. Kael hit the manual thrust override. The mule, groaning in protest and trailing smoke, surged forward, scraping violently against the remaining metal frame of Bay 14. They were free of the bay, but not free of the shunt. Kael pushed the ship into a near-vertical ascent, accelerating away from the station. The ship's alarms were screaming, hull breaches, weapon systems offline, structural integrity compromised. Behind him, the shunt lit up like a vengeful star. Every remaining gun platform, every drone, every patrol ship was now targeting the mule. Energy blasts started hammering the rear shields. The ship bucked and rattled. Kael pushed the throttle to the absolute maximum, ignoring the red warnings flashing across the console. He was flying blind, relying on instinct and the sheer will to survive. He plunged the mule into the nearest asteroid field, using the dense, chaotic debris as cover, jinking and weaving, forcing the automated targeting systems of the shunt to lose lock. It took 10 minutes of terrifying, high-G maneuvering before the firing stopped. Kael pushed the ship out of the asteroid field and jumped into the deep black, setting a course for a remote, unmonitored nebula on the fringes of the Assembly's territory. He slumped back in his seat, his body aching, his ears ringing. He was alive. The ship was damaged, but flying. He looked at his data slate. The remaining credit balance was stark. 12,000 credits, enough for maybe 3 days of fuel and rations. His retirement fund was gone, vaporized in plasma charges and bribes. He reached back, gently touching the extraction pack. The weight was still there. He unzipped the pack and carefully pulled out the small, handheld sonic emitter, silencing the all-clear frequency. The 3 Xyth hatchlings inside were huddled together, silent but alive. Kael reached in and gently touched the chitin of the nearest hatchling. He didn't expect a reaction, but the young Xyth shifted, and then a faint, tiny sound echoed from the pack. It wasn't the frantic clicking of fear or the desperate thrumming of distress. It was a soft, rhythmic pulse pause, a pattern that Kael instantly recognized from the archives, the Xyth sound for safety or rest. Kael closed the pack, securing the hatchlings. He had traded a fortune for a damaged ship and a lifetime of running, but in that small sound he had his payment. He was now a wanted man, by the broker, by the Iron Dogs, and soon by Commander Varus and the full might of the Assembly, who would realize their high-value asset, M7, was now worthless if her lineage could not be secured. Kael leaned forward, his hands gripping the controls of the battered mule. He had a long journey ahead, first to find a safe place to hide, and then to figure out how to reunite a mother and her children, a task that felt impossibly huge, yet profoundly simple. He was a survivor, and now he was a protector. He set the autopilot for the nebula, pulled out his tools, and began the long, hard process of fixing the damage. He wasn't free, not by a long shot, but the weight on his conscience, the paralyzing lead that had settled in his gut on the arbitrator, was finally gone. The debt was paid. The real fight had just begun.